Now let's take a look at the node graph. I've color-coded the nodes so it's easier to understand the structure of the power grade. The orange nodes are the pre-negative emulation image prep, the violet nodes are the actual negative emulation, and the olive nodes are the output transform. I'll run through what each node does, plus explain what can be adjusted within each node. The first node is a color space transform that converts array log C into linear. The only changes you should make to this node are the adjustments mentioned in the earlier section. If you're using one of the two Alexa transforms, leave this node as is. The next node is the matrix, which is the core of the film emulation. It's doing the heavy lifting in matching the Alexa to film. Leave this node as is. The exposure balance node is the first of three nodes where you can make major adjustments to the footage. What can be done and what tools can be used varies depending on the node. It's easier to explain all these nodes at the same time, so I'll run through all three at the end. This node uses a CST to convert from linear back to log C. Leave this node as is unless you encounter out-of-gamut color clipping. The power grade is designed to minimize out-of-gamut clipping, but if you do encounter it, it can usually be resolved by enabling gamut mapping. This exposure balance node is another of the main adjustment nodes, which I'll explain at the end. This node rolls off the brightest highlights, smoothing out the abrupt transition at the clipping point. Without this node, the clipping point will sometimes be noticeable if the surrounding non-clipped area has a lot of saturation. These three nodes are the saturation, hue, and luminosity components of the negative film emulation. They're the finer adjustments made after the core transform, performed by the matrix node. You can adjust these however you see fit, but do so with care, as it's easy to upset the balance within each node. Generally, it's only the hue node I make changes to, and I usually only do it on a project-wide basis. You probably don't want to grade shot to shot in these nodes, as it's just not efficient, but if, for example, something in your project is consistently the wrong hue, you can make the required adjustment in the hue node, then copy that node project-wide. You can also experiment with mixing the saturation, hue, or luma nodes between the two film emulations. For example, combining the more pastel saturation of 250D with a hue and luma of 500T. This next node really shows the benefits of emulating film via power grade. Correcting in this node allows you to correct within the negative emulation itself. So unlike LUT or plugin based emulations, you're not just limited to correcting before or after it. Qualifications in this node are easier as they are being done on a saturated image. And because they occur before other parts of the negative emulation, like the halation and film tint nodes, you are correcting on a relatively pure and neutral image, which makes qualifying easy. Use this node for corrections that might only apply to certain shots, or corrections that go beyond the color warper tool in the previous three nodes. So for example, you can qualify skin tones and use the mid-tone detail tool to smooth skin texture, or you can use hue versus hue curves to unify the tone. And a quick tip, don't automatically qualify skin and correct the color in every shot. If you find you need to do this often, it's usually an indication that your initial color balance is off. So try to fix skin tone issues by revisiting the initial balance before making qualified corrections. The space to the side of the node is there so it's easier to add multiple correction nodes, or so you can stack corrections using parallel nodes. The next node is a compound node that houses the halation. The core effect is split into wide and narrow halation. It is pretty much set and forget, so I don't usually make any changes inside the compound node. There are only two reasons for why you might need to make adjustments. The first is if your camera doesn't record enough stops above middle grey to trigger the halation. This is usually only required if your camera records 6 stops or less above middle grey. You can adjust the luminance level at which the halation kicks in by dragging this point to the left, and you'll need to make this adjustment for both the wide and narrow nodes. The second reason is if your output resolution is a lot larger than your grading resolution. The halation is resolution dependent, so if you grade at 1080p but then output at 8K, you'll find the size of the halation shrinks on the larger output. To adjust the size of the halation, change the project to the final output resolution so you can see an accurate preview, then adjust these sliders up proportionally. But it's only a minor difference between most resolutions, so don't usually worry about it too much. You can also make this adjustment if you're emulating 16 or 8mm film, as the halation needs to appear larger in the frame, and make sure you adjust both the wide and the narrow halation nodes. The next three nodes make up the film tint. It's split into the base, the low, and the high tints. I've split them so it's easier to dial in how much of the film tint you want for your project. The base tint node is the minimum required to create a convincing film emulation. It's enough to give you the film look, but it's not too much that makes the client ask, why are the highlights green? If I'm grading a project that needs to look clean or only needs a hint of the film look, this is the only tint node I leave on. Occasionally, I'll also enable the low tint node as well. If, however, you want the full film look, you can leave the high and low tint nodes enabled. Also, take note that along with the curve adjustments, the low tint node has some color warper adjustments as well. These mainly affect the lower neutrals. Adjust these however you see fit, but do so carefully. You can also mix tints between the two film emulations. The base node is the same in the 500T and 250D emulations. The high node is different, and only the 500T emulation has a unique low tint node, but I've included it in the 250D emulation so you can use it there as well. I prefer the look of the 250D high tint and what it does to skin tones, so occasionally I copy it over when using the 500T power grade. And of course you can make changes to all of these. Next is the sharpening compound node. The sharpening is split into full image sharpening and highlight only sharpening. If you want to increase the sharpening effect, you can make adjustments to the sharpening radius and the amount of sharpening, otherwise known as scaling. I usually don't touch these nodes, but occasionally I'll increase the amount of sharpening on the high node. This can add definition to the image without making it look over sharpened. You can also adjust the luminance level at which the high sharpening begins by adjusting this curve here. But again, I usually leave this as is. Next is the film blur node. This node works in conjunction with the sharpening node and is used to soften the highest frequency details that are present in the original image or have been introduced via sharpening. Generally I leave this set to 0.05, but you can adjust it higher if you want to emulate 16 or 8mm film, or if you want to remove more high frequency details. For 16mm film, look at values of 0.07 to 0.09. For 8mm, look at values of 0.1 and beyond. You can also use this node to add film damage like dirt and scratches. This node is the film curve node. It matches the log-C curve to film. The film curve does not alter the log-C middle grey point. Therefore, the output remains faithful to the original exposure. This is useful as it maintains compatibility with any transform that expects log-C as the input. You can adjust this curve however you like, but generally I leave it as is. This next node adds even more roll-off into the highlights. Some of my first scans had this extra roll-off, which I liked, so I've recreated it here. Enable this if you want a more organic look, and adjust it however you see fit. This is the grain compound node. This is the only node that requires a studio version of Resolve. If you don't have the studio version, or prefer to use another grain plugin or grain texture overlay, place it at this position. For most projects, I usually leave the grain node as is, but if you want larger grain, you can adjust the size here. I usually keep the value at 0.45 as that matches 35mm grain. A value of 0.55 to 0.6 is closer to 16mm grain, and 0.7 and beyond is closer to 8mm. And if you want the grain to be more visible, you can adjust the opacity here. You can also adjust how the grain is applied over the luminance range by modifying this curve here, but I usually leave it as is. This node is the last of the major adjustment nodes, which I'll cover at the end. This next node applies the Kodak 2383 output LUT. The LUT comes in 3 main versions, each featuring a different curve. The 3 curves are standard, middle grey, and Rec 709. The standard version, as you can probably guess, features a standard unmodified 2383 curve. There's also an alternate 0 black level variation, which features a modified toe that allows the black level to hit 0. The middle grey version is the same curve, but modified so that it doesn't alter the log-C middle grey point. Therefore, it doesn't lower the exposure like the standard version does. This is useful as it maintains the integrity of the exposure from the original camera negative through the film curve node all the way through to the output LUT. This makes for a streamlined workflow if the footage is exposed correctly via false colour, light meter, or in-camera versions of the LUTs. The middle grey version also has the alternate 0 black level variation. The Rec 709 version features a standard log-C to Rec 709 curve, but with a toe that more closely resembles the standard 2383 toe. However, the black level is still able to hit 0 like a standard Rec 709 curve. Each version also has a finished variation. The finished variation is a more complete version of the 2383 LUT, closer to a modern show LUT version of 2383. Amongst a variety of corrections, it allows for deeper, richer colours that are difficult to achieve with the standard 2383 LUT and the tools in Resolve. So how do you decide which LUT to use? There is no right or wrong answer here, but there are some recommendations. If you want the authentic heavy print LUT look and are familiar with grading under a print LUT, use the standard version. If you want a slightly less heavy look that requires less adjustments, use the middle grey version. If you want a slightly crisper look or want to control how the shadows roll off into black, use the 0 black level variations. If you only want a hint of the print LUT look, use the Rec 709 version. And if you want deeper, richer colours, select the finish variation of any of those. One other modification I made to the print LUTs is to strip the RGB curves or tints. This allows you to define your own tint curves. This node adds a hint of the print LUT tints, but it's neutral enough that it can be used on projects where you don't want the heavy print LUT look. This is what I use for most commercial projects. For a heavier, more standard print LUT look, you can use this node here, which is a modified version of the standard 2383 tints. You can of course make changes to both of these. You can also disable them or replace them completely with the tints from the 2383 and 2393 power grades. This node changes the white point to D55. It's used purely for aesthetic effect and is not for the purpose of white balancing the image. Use it to warm up the image, which I think gives it a more vintage analog look. All of these output nodes can be replaced entirely with either the 2383 or 2393 non-FM power grades. You can also replace them with any print film LUT, or you can delete all of them and replace them with a simple curve for a non-print LUT film emulation look. This node emulates gate weave. It's pretty subtle and is mostly only visible on locked off shots. I only enable this if I want the full emulation look, but generally I leave it off. Now let's take a look at the three main nodes or areas where you can make major adjustments. These two exposure/balance nodes are part of the image prep section of the power grade. Adjustments made in these nodes occur prior to the negative emulation. The basic purpose of these nodes is to correctly place your image where it needs to be to get the most out of the negative emulation and output transform. They are also used for general shot-to-shot matching. This first node operates in linear space. By linearizing the log footage, we return it to a very close approximation of how the camera originally observed the scene, as digital camera sensors are linear devices. Exposure and white balance adjustments in linear space are accurate and appear natural, with results that are comparable, and sometimes even better than what is possible in the RAW tab. And it works equally well on RAW and non-RAW footage. It works so well that apart from verifying the correct color science, gamut and gamma, I rarely use the RAW tab anymore. Adjustments in this node should only be made with gain-based tools, the main two being the gain wheel and the master gain wheel. Using any other tool is not recommended and will likely produce undesirable results, so just stick to these two. The master gain wheel controls exposure. Use this tool to set the correct exposure for your image and to match the exposure between shots. Because it operates in linear space, it's very easy to make precise, technically accurate corrections that mirror adjustments on a real lens. Doubling this value from 1 to 2 results in an increase of exposure of exactly 1 stop. Doubling the number again is another stop. And in the same way, halving the value decreases the exposure by exactly 1 stop. And it's obviously not just whole numbers. Doubling or halving any value still represents a whole stop. The gain wheel controls the color balance of the image. It's the equivalent of temperature and tint, but in a much more intuitive and quicker to adjust way. Use this tool to color balance your image and to match the balance between shots. Apart from shot matching, adjustments in this node can be approached in two ways: correction and creative intent. For correction, you can use this node to remove any color cast from your image. This allows a negative film emulation to output clean colors with maximum separation. Do this if you plan to make major qualifications or hue adjustments downstream from the negative emulation, as it gives you the best, most neutral base to work from. Or do this if you want a clean look. The way I generally approach this correction is to look at the skin tone and adjust the wheel until it looks correct, and then verify with a vector scope. If this is done correctly, all the other colours in the scene should then fall into their correct positions. If there is no skin tone, look for something in the scene that should be neutral and adjust it until it is. If there is neither in the scene, adjust until the image looks good. There is no right or wrong here. If the image looks good, then it is good. For creative intent, use this node to accentuate what is already present in the scene or to push the image where you want it to go creatively. For example, you could add extra warmth to a sunset that wasn't warm enough, or you can cool down and darken a scene that was shot too neutral for the desired effect. Because this method reduces colour separation, it's best done when you likely won't be qualifying and correcting downstream, as it will be difficult to do so. If you need to make qualifications, aim for a neutral balance here, then add the look in the third of the main adjustment nodes. This way, the look is downstream from the qualifications. The second exposure balance node serves the exact same purpose as the first, except the tools differ as it's not operating in linear space. Here, the master offset wheel controls exposure, and the offset wheel controls colour balance. Use this node if you prefer to work with standard film grading tools. Because this node operates in log, the results aren't as technically accurate or natural as the previous node, so I don't make exposure or balance adjustments here. The two main tools I use in this node are contrast pivot and saturation. The way I approach the use of contrast and saturation is mainly for correcting issues and for shot-to-shot matching. For example, if a lens used in the project has less contrast than the rest of the set, add contrast and make it match here. If the sun goes behind some clouds, reducing contrast and saturation compared to other shots, add it back in here. Well shot, correctly exposed footage captured with decent lenses likely won't need any contrast or saturation corrections at this point. But you might still want to make adjustments for creative reasons. In that case, it's usually best done in the last of the three adjustment nodes. It's also okay to bypass this node completely and leave all contrast and saturation corrections to the final node as well. Do this if you want a simpler workflow. It will produce slightly different results, but unless you are doing major corrections, the differences won't be too noticeable. This node is the third and final of the main adjustment nodes. It sits after the entire negative emulation, therefore working in this node is similar to working on a film scan. Anything that can be done to a real film scan can be done here. The main use for this node is to grade and shape the image. You can use any tool or technique that gets you the desired result, and you don't need to do it in a single node. You can add as many nodes as you need at this position. Here is where you would apply a look if you went for a neutral balance in the earlier nodes. You can also do all your shot-to-shot contrast and saturation corrections in this node as mentioned earlier. You can also do project-wide adjustments here too. For example, if the print LUT you are using is adding too much or not enough contrast and saturation for the desired look, this is where you could adjust it. I usually do project-wide adjustments in an extra node at this position to keep them separate from shot-to-shot corrections. These three nodes might seem confusing at first, but once you start working with them, you'll soon get a feel for which adjustments are best done in each node. Just make sure you stick to the recommended tools I've mentioned, especially for the first linear node. And remember, if you're ever in doubt as to whether you have done something correctly or not, if the image looks good, then it is good.